Hello, everybody. Welcome to another episode of Speaking Openly Peer-to-Peer. This is an ASI initiative where teachers speak to teachers in uncommonly heard conversations about our own lives, about what it's like to be a teacher, and the dynamics that we're faced with in contemporary spirituality. Today, I'm speaking with Laurel Freisch. I met Laurel last year. I was working in her town in Atlanta, Georgia, and we spoke a little bit about our styles, about different ways of touching our communities, and found that we use different language, we understand different things by the same terms, and it was like, oh my gosh, here's this whole other area of diversity that exists within two teaching styles that are ultimately pointing to the same thing. So some months later, we've decided, okay, let's talk about this and record it and see where it goes. And so, Laurel, thank you so much for giving us some time today to have this conversation.
Of course, Jack, and it's lovely to see you, as always. And I wanted to add that aside from having a diversity of education in terms of our past, what we really do have, which I love more than anything else, is we feel a very common heart. And, you know, that's lovely. I mean, we're in this together because it's important to both of us. And, you know, it's fantastic to sit and talk with somebody who understands how imperative it is for teachers to really be open with each other, with our students, with the world. So I'm excited.
Yeah.
Thank you, Jack. Thanks for asking me. In the Western world, one of the words, or the main word that a lot of us have for the divine is God. And, you know, understanding that God comes from the German word for good, which sets apart immediately good from bad,
yes.
You know, whereas other cultures don't think of the Godhead that way.
Yes.
You know, if you even look at the Old Testament, which, you know, is like the Hebrew Bible, there must be at least 50, 60 words for God. And some of them are, one of them is threshold, one of them is, you know, synovial joint, you know, place of interface. You know, and then, you know, and many other things that describe attributes, like in Islam, you know, the 99 names and then the one name that could never be expressed.
Yes.
You have that in the Old Testament too. And then if you look at Hinduism and, you know, Buddhism doesn't even talk about God, although they will talk about the ground of being. So, you know, we sort of get into nomenclature and that gets difficult, but that particular sort of looking at the prism through the light of the divine has to be perfect, and everything else, well, first of all, you can't take the divine out of anything. Same way you can't take the water out of the wave. But to say, well, if we don't feel perfect, or we're not being perfect, or we're not actualizing our perfection, then we're, you know, we're the opposite. Is that's the problem, is it came from that idea that God meant, you know, good and evil was separate. And
that's right.
It's hard, you know.
Yeah, yeah. And I was reared in a Christian culture, so I have that lens of perception.
100%. As did
even
people like me who wasn't necessarily, you know, brought up in a Christian household, but I lived in a Christian culture.
Yeah.
So it's pervasive in the Western world.
It is pervasive. It is pervasive. It's a hard lens to break, and I only see problems with it at this level, you know, of where people are speaking about awakening and finding truth. It's a lens that has to be seen through totally.
But it's also the lens, I think, that set up teachers for feeling like they have to be extra specially something brilliant, and therefore can sit in an ivory tower.
There we go.
Because they're identifying themselves with the divine, and that is what the divine means to them.
There we go. That's exactly it. Yeah. And to deify, and our minds, if we're very trained to deify and to have something beyond and transcendental and to find escape there, which minds often do. We want goal, we want fantasy. And so it's easy to deify a teacher, you know, and the problem is if a teacher gets off on it, you know.
It's easy for a teacher to say, well, you know, I need to be deified, because have to be seen like this by my students, but also I think subtly, and where it sort of creeps in a very unconscious way, is if I'm going to associate with the divine, and if the divine for me means ultimate perfection, I have to be perfect. And if I'm thinking of myself as perfect, then perhaps I am more perfect than you who hasn't had this realization yet. And then comes this kind of show of tragedy of horrors in a way, you know, because ultimately you're serving nobody, not yourself and not your students.
That's right. And yet there is some truth in, you know, okay, it's biblical, I'm drawing on Christian again. Yeah. You'll know them by their fruits. Actually, I think I've come across it also in Hindu literature. You know a teacher by their fruits, you know. So where does that overlay with the teacher identifying with being godlike?
Well, you know, I mean,
honest, you know, but honesty is denied, you know, when this pretense goes on, you know.
Exactly, and this is the big question: what is godlike?
Yes, what is godlike? There's the division again. Mm-hmm. It's that separation, which is fundamentally the opposite of what spirituality is about.
It's so interesting because there's a whole tradition in Hasidic Judaism of teaching stories. You know, they like the Sufi. I guess a lot of cultures have stories and they love teaching by story. But there's one story, you know, that I really love that kind of speaks to this in a way. And it's a story about this very wonderful, you know, rabbi, and his community absolutely put him on a pedestal and they adore him. And one day they, you know, see him packing his suitcase and they ask him, where are you going? And he said, well, he's going to go and visit Rabbi Nachman, you know. And they said, but why do you need to visit Rabbi Nachman? What is it about Rabbi Nachman? Like, he should come here. Why are you going there? And he said, no, I want to go because I heard he's wonderful. And I want to go and see how he ties his shoes. And, you know, it's like the story, the meaning is, I want to see how he walks everyday life.
Yes.
You know, and I actually had a magnificent opportunity once to interview. I was teaching a class on the interface between psychology, spirituality, and art. And I was interviewing different artists, and I interviewed the daughter of a very renowned Hasidic rabbi. And she did these amazing collages, and they were nuanced and subtle and gorgeous. And I said to her, I love your work. Who was the teacher who inspired you the most? And she said, without doubt, my father. And I said, I was kind of surprised because I knew her father as being this amazing rabbi, but I said to her, I didn't know that he was an artist. And she said to me, oh, Laurel, you should see the way he pours a cup of tea.
Oh, I love it.
It was just wonderful. It's like the teaching is in his living. It's just, yeah.
In his living.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. So it's much more subtle than...
It's subtle and it's very subtle. It's very much about being present. It's very much about being real. Yes. It's very much, of course, about being compassionate and loving and caring and empathic.
And these are the automatic attributes that come as a consequence of being authentic and honest. It's not that they are picked up as good habits or good practices. They have to evolve out of the maturation.
Exactly. And then you're just with somebody and you feel like, wow, I love being around them.
Yes.
You know.
That's it.
I love being around them because...
Pinpoint or identify the beauty of it. Yeah.
One of the things that I've done for many years is I've been one of the on the call kind of list for spiritual emergencies, and it's a worldwide list, and people call up, and the first question that they ask is, "Am I crazy?"
Yes.
And sometimes they're really struggling psychologically. Sometimes they are really having psychotic breaks, and we have to talk them through it and how to work with it. But sometimes it's just, I just want somebody to hear me.
Yes.
I want somebody to listen to my experience and not put it in a sort of labeled box somewhere that's
right.
Going to be problematic.
Yes, that search for a mirror, for a witness to hear ourselves back and have it reflected. And that's one of the essential things, really, isn't it? That's the purpose of a teacher, is to mirror. Well, I think it's the primary purpose anyway, is to mirror back the student's own inner wisdom, to awaken it so that they can find it for themselves. It's my greatest purpose, is if I can be a mirror, and do that with honesty, without altering the image too much.
Yes, that's right. As being a clear mirror, as clear at least as we're capable. And that's why, it's imperative that we do the work as well. That's right.
Yeah. So that hunger is a natural human thing, for sure. I find to know where you're at. It's almost like when we're on the path, we get some kind of confidence from being able to identify where we're at. And that's really important. For a long phase of it, that's really important, to be able to reference point something during the phases of when your life is being turned upside down, at least your inner life, and sometimes your outer life, upside down and inside out. And it's like, okay, well, whom do I talk to? Who is going to tell me that I'm okay? Who's not going to say, I think you should see a psychiatrist straight off? And somewhere.
Right. Or who is going to tell me I need to see a psychiatrist?
That's right. And that's part of the isolation, is to find somebody who's not going to tell me I'm crazy, because that's my doubt, and I need you to assuage it. I need you to tell me that I'm not crazy, because innately we know we're not crazy. The threat is there because mind is fighting for its life.
Right.
Yeah.
And given that being said, I have absolutely worked with people who have been off-the-wall schizophrenic, and I mean that with the greatest love. Somebody who I've been with said to me, "Can you see that gray man coming out of the stop sign?"
Right.
What I needed to tell him was that no, I couldn't. I understood he could. What does he want to tell me about it? And at some point, help him to understand that this is not what everybody's experiencing.
Yes.
And that because he's having a very different life and, fragmented at times and very difficult for him, there are ways in which perhaps seeing a psychiatrist could help him at least to have a life where he doesn't feel so isolated, where he's not going to say, "Can you see that gray man's coming out of the stop sign?"
Yes.
And, or not going to act in a way that is harmful to himself or others or herself.
Have you found, Laurel, that there's a predisposition to mental health prior to a spiritual search in a scenario such as that case?
A predisposition.
Yeah.
Predisposition is difficult. Sometimes people actually will have a psychotic break when they're in an intense spiritual experience, and that's the first time that they've ever had it.
Yeah.
Whether it's sort of hallucinogenic related, or whether it's an intense experience through trance or, meditation. I've actually worked with a number of people who've been in a very, very intense meditative practice, maybe that they weren't quite ready for. That's really, and by I mean intense, I mean days and days, and maybe limited the amount they're sleeping and what they're eating, and they may have gone for an extended retreat or something like that, and that triggers the break, and that's the first time it's ever shown up.
Right.
So I really feel this is a whole other topic that we never discussed, Jack, and we could discuss another time.
Yeah, that's a whole other
topic. As a teacher, having a training at least to recognize spiritual emergency.
Yes.
It's very different from the sort of beautiful evolutionary lotus opening flower of spiritual emergence, where growth happens and is integrated beautifully over time. But just something that gets triggered like that and can be so disorienting that it can cause a break. So, it's very individual. The spiritual journey is very individual.
Yes, it is. It is. My own path has been different. And I rarely have students who have had a break because of spiritual. Actually, it's only happened once ever. Spirituality actually created the break. I rarely. Well, I've only come across it once ever. Yeah. So I don't think it's that frequent.
So, yeah, I mean, you're lucky. I actually attended, was sort of co-teaching at a Sufi workshop with somebody who had been a teacher for 40 something years. And very first time it happened to him, but a woman in the group got triggered by something and ended up lying in a fetal position by a tree, crying her eyes out, and she'd literally fallen apart. And he said to me, thank God there was somebody, you were here, because I've had training in that, because I wouldn't have known what to do short of, calling the ambulance. It's like, what do you do with that? And then she would have ended up in the ER and put on on meds, and it would have been a disaster for everybody,
But when that type of break comes up for me, I don't see it with that lens, and I just see it as it's a spiritual process. I don't see it as that lens. It's a spiritual process. So you're holding the space, regardless of what's showing up. Regardless of what's showing up, you can transition somebody through, because transformations that are that intense, they're wonderful, because it's really rough and the integration must be monitored closely, but that kind of a transformation is just a gift. It's miraculous,
Well, if you can recognize it, exactly, if you can recognize it for what it really is.
What it is, yeah.
Yeah. But if you've got 50 or 60 people at your workshop, and then this person has lost it on, not just lost it crying. I mean,
yes,
really was hallucinating and all sorts of stuff.
Sure.
And suddenly that co-opts the whole group, and what do you do about it? So, yes, but you're right. It is. It can be a very natural and normal part of the journey.
What I do about it is I tell the whole group really quickly, this person needs all of your support. We have to contain this person within a sacred space to allow their transformation to happen. And so I either tell them to meditate, or I give them a mantra, or direct the energy so that as a group, we're equally holding this one person as they shift through it. And invariably, it
will shift.
It shifts.
Well, I think, Jack, what's beautiful about what you said is that you have a capacity to hold a space for everybody and invite them to hold a space for, what's going on.
Yes.
But I do think this is a conversation that teachers need to have as well.
Yes.
Is what do we do when something like this happens?
Yes.
How do we help ground the person, integrate the person?
Yes.
The teaching in the field is to stop the person meditating, to have them actually, start eating as many grounding foods as they could eat, to bring them, back to earth, as it were. I've had people insist that they will not eat meat, even though sometimes it's very helpful for them to do it just because it's very grounding immediately.
Very grounding.
But then potatoes, root vegetables, anything that, sitting on the ground, being on the earth.
Yes.
And slowly reintegrating that way. But this is definitely a conversation that, I think teachers need to have. I love that we're having it. And to share with each other, what are our tools,
That's right.
What is it that we can learn from each other? What can we, share with each other?
And what I've found from, through the work of the ASI and having these conversations, there really are a huge amount of skills that we need to have as teachers. We need to have this.
Right.
We need to have these skills. We need to know when a student is traumatized and when, they're coming from that lens of trauma. Needs to be held, or maybe they need to be referred to somebody else. But we cannot go in and have boundary issues ourselves. And is a teacher able to recognize when a student has trauma? Because that student is in a very different space. And how many skills do we need to have? Like loads. And what happens? We've got no training. We've got no training. There's no regulation. I'm not into regulation, but yet there are guidelines from it that we are,
this brings me to, I think, a really important point. You referenced that Holy Hell movie.
Yes.
I actually happened to be with one of the people from that group when she was having, she was having the DTs, withdrawal from drug and alcohols, but severely and needed to be hospitalized. So I was driving her to the hospital when her teacher, the Lord of the universe in his mind, basically called her to tell her that, to scream at me, tell me that I had no right to interfere, but to tell her to drop her mind. Right. And and I, obviously wasn't going to listen to him because he didn't know what he was talking about. And I have had, training as a therapist in addiction. So I knew how serious it was. And thank God, we got her to the hospital. But the point is, this is one of the advantages of being in a lineage. And not every teacher needs to have a lineage or has had a lineage.
Yes.
But if you haven't, at least be connected to other teachers who have been, so that we can all, learn. This particular guy that I'm talking about had no teachers. He lied about having a teacher. He just was in his own whatever head and very narcissistic about it, and actually was very dangerous as a result.
Yes.
But if we can understand that our jobs are to be as informed as we can be, besides, having our own deep process. And clearly we've had it, otherwise we wouldn't be in this situation and we wouldn't draw people to us on some level. But to be authentic in it is, again, very much part of the conversation, that we're having, and a part of a conversation I think every teacher needs to have.
Yes.
Yes. One of the beautiful things that I can honestly say, by the grace of the, the universe, whatever you want to call it, is that some of my earliest teachers were indigenous people, because I grew up in Africa. And having them, they had their special place in the community. And I've seen the same thing in Native American communities. There is the healer and the faith keeper. But people come to them for their wisdom and their knowledge. But when they're not in that particular role, in other words, when I'm not throwing your bones or recommending plants, medicine or whatever it is, I'm equal to you, who is, the cobbler, or the person pulling the vegetables for the day, or the guy hunting for the food for the group. It's not like they don't have the same kind of hierarchical structure in indigenous communities. And so there's never the sort of sense of, because I do this, I am special. It's no, we're all special and we all have our place and we can honor that. And I come to you when I need your wisdom the same way as I'm going to go to somebody else when I need them to do the hunting, or I need them to, do the gathering, or whatever it is.
Yes. And this is important for students to recognize. It's like your own autonomy. Cultivate it, nurture it. Because at the end of the day, you're the one who has to, is that bullshit or is that authentic? They have to be able to discern for themselves.
Yeah.
especially since we don't have any criteria or prior education is necessary to become a teacher. It's like, hang up your shingle, off you go, you're a teacher. You know, how does a student discern? And so for students to know, okay, I've got to be specially vigilant here just to keep myself on track. And if I make a mistake, I learn from it, but I come from it. I come from it because I remember that on my own path. It's like I really, by following this teacher that I don't know anything about, he had no website, no nothing. I physically couldn't meet him. He was on retreat, but the pull was huge from my heart. I'm like, all right, so if he's a jerk, I've got to face that. If he's a jerk. And I spent a fair bit of time thinking about that. I'm like, okay, if he's a jerk, I'm up for it. I'm up for it. There's a blind spot and I can't find it. If there's that blind spot. But he was authentic and it was fine. But I went in knowing that this could go belly up. And I learned from that too. So I was prepared for it. And I think that tool might be useful for students to know that like you have decided that this is somebody you trust and you want to take their guidance. You're responsible for that at the end of the day. You are responsible for it. Because, you know, both parties have to tidy up their act, you know, in that the power must be given to the student and the student must take their power and must use it well, you know, and then for the teacher to have more integrity and honesty and to get out of their ivory tower and to embrace their humanness and their divinity and the whole package. You know, if we can find a new right relationship that honors the boundaries, that honors each other in a shared dynamic that supports both. You know, there's a healthy model, I think, that can emerge from these types of highlighted aspects of the culture that we're highlighting, you know?
Yeah. I love that term, healthy model. And model it, I think we must, because, you know, as much as you say, I stepped into this environment and I decided, am I looking for authenticity or is this person going to be a jerk? There are a lot of people who are drawn to the spiritual world who are so wounded that they don't even have that capacity for discrimination.
That's right.
And then, of course, there are teachers that are going to abuse that, and that's really unfortunate. But those of us that are saying, okay, let's come into the groups, let's come into this work and into this environment, understanding that every single one of us is an expression of the divine. Every single one of us has an authentic voice.
Yes.
And it's up to us to, you know, as we said, keep ourselves accountable to ourselves, to each other, to our fellow teachers, and to our students, you know, to be able to say to our students, you know, maybe I didn't get it right, or maybe I missed the mark. And if so, please come talk to me about it.
Yes.
And we can sort of look at this.
Yes.
And also to say, and I love it, one of my wonderful teachers was a guy called Pierre Vilayat Khan, who is no longer with us on the planet, but, you know, was the peer in the Sufi order, it was called then, for a lot of the 60s and 70s and early 80s. And he always used to say, you know, take what's meaningful for you and leave the rest. You know, this is not anything that anybody needs to shove down your throat, or, you know, that you know, it's got to work with you. It's got to sit with you if you need to leave.
Yes.
And it's also, this is something I think really imperative too. And that is when a teacher needs to be able to say to a student, you know, no longer need to work with me, or you no longer need to work with me as often as you have. You know, I had a group in the Denver Boulder area in Colorado. We worked together. They were fantastic for 10 years. And when it was time for me to leave, I mean, the growth is exponential and they continue to grow. They're beautiful human beings. This group has done amazing work. And I love them, you know, dearly for everything they've done and for who they are and for how they show up on the planet. But there was a time when I recognized they didn't need me as much, certainly, you know, nearly as much as maybe a check-in every now and then. So I sent them this little email and I said, when the student is ready, the teacher appears. When the student is really ready, the teacher disappears.
Beautiful.
And, I've seen that show up in the psychotherapeutic world too, where therapists hang on to clients for too long, unhealthily. I always say, my work really is to make myself redundant.
That's right.
And it takes a lot of faith in the universe, especially, who's going to support me from the psychotherapeutic dynamic when people continue these relationships far too long and much too, and not shifting the sort of locus of authority back onto the student or the client and saying, well, wait a minute, you're beautiful as much as anybody is beautiful, and you're powerful as much as anyone is powerful.
And for the teacher never to take all of the authority, never, But
right, and also to know when to let go and say, okay, baby birds can fly.
That's right.
Don't need me.
And to nurture the authority of the student all along, but never to create that dependency,
Right. Yeah.
I wonder if there are teachers watching this. I'd love to ask them, have they ever apologized to a student for something? I think it's a test, when we screw up, because it happens all the time to everybody.
Of course.
And when we recognize something, rather than, the mind will always go to some explanation to soften the suffering. It will turn things around. And there's nothing quite like non-dual language to allow for that. To make an excuse for something, to reframe it in order to abdicate responsibility, and I think if teachers are in a habit of actually, I can reframe it, but it's actually more authentic to apologize here. I think that would be an interesting thing to promote. And to actually find out, okay, do we apologize?
Right. Do we apologize, or do we put ourselves in the position of, I know everything?
Yes. And do we twist and turn the language? Because we can reframe anything. All the jargon is there, especially in the non-dual. All the jargon is there. Probably in every religion at some point where we get into the paradoxical language. It can be twisted and turned,
one of the I'm going to call it a theory. I don't know that he would call it a theory, but certainly and not advocating everything that he has said and taught, but I like where he's coming from with this. It's Ken Wilber's naming what he calls the pre-trance fallacy, and what he means by that is mistaking pre-egoic understanding for trans-egoic understanding, and vice versa. In other words, saying, I'm going to put it in his language a little bit right now, but then we can try and find a real world example, but saying, an experience that the noetic experience that a baby has, where it's still very subsumed in the first few months with the mother and that experience, and saying, oh, this is the highest mystical experience. And in fact, it's not, because the highest mystical experience knows the experience of individuation. By the same token, saying, oh, I'm having this highest mystical experience, and therefore I'm bypassing all my own wounding because I'm not going to look at that because I'm special. Right? So this pre-trans fallacy of mistaking what is. So you can say, another way of saying it, if you look at it in non-dual languages, every voice is of equal importance. So if somebody is a mass murderer, they're equally okay as somebody who is with great compassion. And, it's not true. Like, there is a difference between a pile of roses and, excuse my language, but a pile of shit,
Yeah.
They have a different effect on us. And so, to be able to say, even working with students, let's look at what's really going on here.
Yes.
And, and again, as teachers, if we're going to use non-dual language to excuse our behavior, really what we're doing is bypassing and avoiding.
Yes.
So call it like it is.
That's right. Call it like it is.
I loved it. Once I was sitting with the Dalai Lama, and somebody in the group asked him about the meaning of ahimsa, non-violence. And he said to them, if you're sitting and somebody comes at you and they're screaming and they're ranting and they're raving, and you can hold a space and let them, get it out of their system and just be there, that's non-violence. But if you're sitting and they're coming at you with an AK-47 and you carry on sitting, you're no longer practicing non-violence. Then what you're practicing is stupidity.
Yes, beautiful.
So, the ability to really name what you're seeing.
Yes.
And then act accordingly.
Yes.
And in yourself as much as,
yes.
Fostering
your
student to be able to look at that. And I really feel like as teachers, we've got to be a living example. My students have to be able to see me screw up.
Yes.
Because, that gives them permission to know that the world's not going to end if they screw up, and also they can grow beyond that,
That's right.
They don't have to stay identified with the screw up.
Yes.
So
and to know how it is, is that it's healthy to be an ongoing growth project, and that.
Well, this is what I say: the universe is expanding. It doesn't expand if it stays in the same whatever it is.
Yes.
There's always growth.
There's always ongoing evolution. There is.
Yes.
There is. And it's part of that, isn't it? It's part of that denial of one lens of perception for another one. When that human evolution is denied, it's picking and choosing. Well, what lens of perception do I want to look through here? Which one makes me better, look better, feel more special? And what a shame that happened.
Right. And then, the capacity to look and say, but why do I need to feel more special?
There we go. There's the work.
Better,
There's the psychological inquiry that always has to have a place,
Yeah.
And why would one want to be beyond psychological inquiry? What would that, where would that come from? I'm intrigued personally. Why would you think it's good to be beyond psychological improvement and inquiry and growth? It's bizarre, to actually deify that.
Yes, and I think part of wanting to be beyond it is not wanting to own our vulnerability. Having been hurt, maybe very wounded as a child from being vulnerable.
Yes.
Having been even as simply as scolded at Sunday school, or, told you were stupid by a teacher, and feeling diminished by that, and really feeling the need to not feel that in order to feel okay. And then there is a whole other paradigm where, there's a syndrome of people who actually were only reinforced by their parents when they were good and when they did excellent work and whatever. So the message they got is, in order to be lovable, I have to always be good. And if I'm not good, I'm not lovable.
Here we go.
So, but I need to be loved because I'm human, and humans are social creatures, and the need to be loved is part of our
yes.
Being in community. So
yes, and there's nothing quite like the potential group attention that a teacher can get from students. And it's quite sick when there is a need in a teacher to get something for themselves personally from the group of students. What exploitation. It breaks my heart, but I see it a lot.
Yeah. I know that there are some Sufi teachers that I know who have only allowed their students to become teachers when the students no longer want to teach. Like that desire to be a teacher is not driving them anymore.
That's right.
Then they say, okay, now you're ready.
That's right.
And then the response very often is, do I have to?
That's right. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that's one of my tenets also, is like, you will not want to teach. A good teacher will never want to teach. It will just be thrust upon you and you'll have no option. Yeah. Yeah. It's like, do everything you can to stop being a teacher. And if it happens in spite of that, okay. Now you can be a teacher.
Yeah. Right. Then you sort of acquiesce to your karma and your dharma and
that's right.
That's
right. It's not desire driven. It's cleaned out of desire. Yeah.
So I don't know where we are time-wise, Jack. I feel like we've been talking and it's been wonderful. But
it's great, yeah. And when it comes to a natural close, it comes to a natural close, you know.
So what is your sense? I mean, we could talk about these things for the next 70,000 years.
We could, but I think we've made an interesting start, Laurel. Don't you?
I do.
Yeah. I do. So I close off the recording. Thank you guys and gals and whoever has been watching this ASI production. Thank you for listening and for engaging in the conversation, and please post in the comment boxes below if you want to participate in any way. Thank you, Laura.
Thank you. Thank you very much.